There are debts that time does not erase. They wait in the fields, in the ledgers, in the faces of those we thought we'd never see again. And when they come due, they collect everything: fortune, name, and breath itself. Pay close attention to what happens when a man tries to bury his past in the cane rows of Louisiana. Because in 1847, in the parish courthouse of St. James, a planter named Thomas Carver stood before his creditors and neighbors while a stranger read aloud the evidence of his ruin. Years of falsified records, skimmed inheritances, forged signatures on loan documents that had kept Belmont Plantation afloat when it should have drowned in debt. The room watched a respected man come apart, his mask cracking with every number spoken into the humid air. But here's what Thomas Carver didn't know, what he couldn't see even as the walls closed in. The man destroying him wasn't a stranger. He was someone Thomas should have recognized the moment he arrived. Someone Thomas had erased from his own memory 20 years earlier, when he'd signed the papers and pocketed $800 for selling his own brother south. If you want to see how a man's past comes back to collect, subscribe now and stay until the end. 2 weeks before that courthouse reckoning, a traveling buyer named Elias stepped off the steamboat at the Belmont Landing. He carried a leather satchel, a letter of introduction from a Philadelphia merchant house, and a small account book he'd kept hidden for 2 decades. The August heat pressed down on the river like a hand. The cane fields stretched green and endless, and somewhere in those rows, Elias had once cut stalk until his hands bled, and his back learned the shape of the overseer's whip. He gave no sign of recognition. Not when he walked the path to the main house, not when he saw the quarters where he'd slept on a dirt floor, not when an old man with milky eyes and a cane limped past. The same overseer who'd beaten him for moving too slow, now half blind and soft around the middle. Thomas Carver met him on the gallery, hand extended, smile easy. A man in his late 40s, graying at the temples, dressed in linen that stayed crisp despite the heat. He looked prosperous. He looked respectable. He looked like a man who'd built something through hard work and good sense, not like a man who'd sold his own blood to cover a gambling debt in a Lexington card room. Mr. Elias, welcome to Belmont. Your letter said you're looking at forward contracts for next season's crop. Elias shook his hand, felt the soft palm, no calluses, no scars. 20 years, and Thomas had forgotten his younger brother's face, or convinced himself he had. That's right. My employer wants to secure quality before the market tightens. I'll need to review your production records, assess your processing operation, verify consistency. Thomas waved toward the house. Of course, whatever you need. Belmont's yields speak for themselves. Come inside. We'll start with the ledgers. They walked into the cool dimness of the study. Shelves lined with account books. A desk of dark wood, papers stacked in neat piles. Thomas pulled down 3 ledgers, leather-bound, pages dense with columns of figures. Harvest totals, hogshead weights, market prices, loan payments. 5 years of records, Thomas said. You'll see we've maintained strong output even in difficult seasons. Consistency is what separates a well-run operation from the gamblers. Elias opened the first ledger. Let his eyes move down the columns. The numbers were too clean, too steady. A sugar plantation in Louisiana weather, hurricanes, droughts, floods, cane blight, didn't produce the same yield 3 years running, unless someone was writing fiction. He looked up, smiled. Impressive consistency. Thomas relaxed, poured 2 glasses of whiskey. I believe in honest accounting. A man's word is his country, Mr. Elias. Without that, we're no better than savages. Elias took the glass. Let the phrase settle. A man's word is his country. Thomas had said that to him once, a lifetime ago, right before forging the sale documents and telling their mother that Elias had run off. I'll need a few days to go through everything thoroughly, Elias said, if that's acceptable. Take all the time you need. I'll have someone set up a workspace for you, and I'd like you to tour the operation tomorrow. See the mill, the fields, meet the overseer. You'll understand the quality better when you see the process. That night, alone in the study with the ledgers spread before him, Elias found what he already knew he'd find. The yields were inflated by 15 to 20%, year over year. Thomas had reported hogsheads that never existed, used the false numbers to secure loans from a New Orleans factor, then skimmed just enough from actual production to make the interest payments without the creditor looking too close. It was elegant, in a way. It would work forever, as long as no one audited the raw processing logs against the reported output. Elias copied 3 pages of figures into his own notebook. Not enough to convict. Not yet. But enough to start asking questions. He opened the small leather account book he'd carried for 20 years. The pages were filled with numbers, row after row, copied in a careful hand that had taught itself to write using discarded tally sheets and bits of charcoal. Every figure in this book belonged to Thomas. Stolen from the margins of documents Thomas had thrown away, practiced in secret while the other men slept, learned because a man who could read numbers could see the shape of his own captivity, and maybe, someday, find a way out. Elias set the book on the corner of Thomas's desk. Knew Thomas would see it in the morning, glance at it, assume it was something Elias had brought for his own notes. He wouldn't open it, wouldn't recognize his own numbers reflected back at him. The next day, Thomas walked him through the fields. The cane stood taller than a man, green and thick. The air smelled like earth and smoke from the boiling house. Enslaved men and women moved through the rows, cutting, bundling, loading the carts. Elias saw faces he might have known once, or faces that looked like faces he'd known. He said nothing. The overseer joined them, a younger man now, harder, quicker with the whip than the old one had been. He watched Elias with the wariness of a man whose job depends on reading trouble before it arrives. "You ask a lot of questions," the overseer said. "That's my job. You ask questions about people, about who used to work here, about men sold off years ago." Elias met his eyes. "I like to understand labor consistency. Turnover affects quality." The overseer didn't look convinced, but Thomas waved him off. "Mr. Elias is thorough. That's what we want in a buyer." But that night, Thomas came to the study earlier than usual, stood in the doorway, watching Elias work. "My overseer says you've been asking about old hands, men who aren't here anymore." Elias didn't look up from the ledger. "I ask about everything. It's how I assess risk." "What kind of risk?" "The kind that comes from unstable operations. High turnover, management changes, production gaps that don't match the reported numbers." Thomas stepped into the room, closed the door. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm verifying. Your records show impressive consistency. I want to make sure that consistency is real." Silence. Thomas poured himself a drink, didn't offer one to Elias this time. "You'll find everything in order," Thomas said. "Belmont has nothing to hide." Elias closed the ledger, looked at Thomas directly. "Then there's nothing to worry about." After Thomas left, Elias sat in the dark study and listened to the night sounds. Crickets, distant voices from the quarters, the creak of the house settling. He thought about the leather account book on the desk, still untouched. He thought about the letter he'd written that morning to Thomas's stepson in Mobile, the man whose inheritance Thomas had been stealing from for years. He thought about the factor in New Orleans who would receive copies of these falsified ledgers in 3 days. The clock was running. The parish settlement, the annual reckoning when planters and creditors gathered to reconcile debts and reputations, was 12 days away. And Thomas Carver still had no idea who was sitting in his study, turning his own numbers into a noose. The problem was this: Thomas Carver thought he was in control. He woke early the next morning, before the overseer's horn sounded across the fields, and sat at his desk reviewing the same ledgers Elias had studied the night before. He ran his finger down columns of numbers, production figures that looked steady, reassuringly consistent. He didn't see what Elias had seen. He didn't see the pattern of impossible yields, the crops that somehow thrived through floods and cold snaps, the weights that never varied, no matter the weather. He saw proof of his own competence. Elias appeared in the doorway just after dawn, already dressed, his face neutral. "Morning, Mr. Carver. I'd like to walk the fields today, if that suits you. See the cane up close, check the soil quality." Thomas looked up, smiled. "Of course. I'll have Matthews take you out." "Matthews?" "The overseer. He knows every acre." Elias nodded slowly. He knew Matthews. 20 years ago, Matthews had been younger, meaner, faster with the whip. Now he was old, half-blind in one eye, but still working because Thomas trusted him. "That'd be fine," Elias said. What Thomas didn't know was that Elias had already sent the letter to Mobile. It was on a coach heading east, carrying copies of the estate accounts Thomas had skimmed from his late wife's holdings, money that legally belonged to her son, a man named Richard Dupree, who rarely visited and had trusted Thomas to manage everything. The letter would arrive in 4 days. Richard Dupree would read it, and then he would start the long journey back to Louisiana with a lawyer and a lot of questions. Elias walked the fields with Matthews that morning. The old overseer moved stiffly, leaning on a stick, squinting against the sun. He talked the whole time about yields, about the hands, about which rows were producing and which weren't. He pointed to a group of men cutting cane near the far edge of the property. "That section's always been trouble," Matthews said. "Soil's too wet. But Mr. Carver, he insists we work it anyway. Says we need the numbers." Elias watched the men swing their blades. He recognized the rhythm, the way they moved to conserve strength in the heat. He'd done that work. His hands still carried the scars. "You ever lose any hands from this field?" Elias asked. Matthews shrugged. "Some. Sold a few south years back. 1 or 2 ran off. Most stay." "You remember their names?" Matthews glanced at him, suspicious now. "Why?" "Just curious. I like to know the history of a place before I commit my employer's money." The overseer studied him for a long moment. There was something in his face. Recognition, maybe, or the edge of it. But he couldn't place it. Elias had changed too much. 20 years of sun and labor and learning had reshaped him into someone Matthews's failing eyes couldn't quite see. "No," Matthews said finally. "I don't remember names. Too many over the years." They walked back to the house in silence. That afternoon, Elias requested more records. Thomas hesitated. "I've already shown you the production ledgers," Thomas said. They were standing in the study again, the windows open to let in the breeze. "What else do you need?" "Purchase records," Elias said. I want to see what you're spending on equipment, on labor. My employer needs a complete picture. Thomas's jaw tightened. Those records are private. Then I can't recommend the contract. The silence stretched. Thomas looked at the desk, at the neat stacks of papers he controlled so carefully. He didn't let anyone see these records. Not the overseer, not the factor in New Orleans, not even the bank when they'd extended his last loan. The numbers in those pages told a different story than the production ledgers, a story of expenses that didn't exist, of equipment never purchased, of money that had flowed into Thomas's pockets instead of the estate's accounts. But he needed this contract. He needed the cash. Fine, Thomas said. I'll have them brought up, but Matthews stays with you while you work. Elias smiled. Of course. Pay close attention to what happened next, because this is where the trap began to close. Elias spent 3 days in that study, with Matthews sitting in the corner, watching. He read through years of purchase records, comparing them to the production ledgers, finding the gaps. A plow that was paid for, but never delivered. Wages for hands who'd been sold 2 years prior. Repairs to a barn that had burned down and never been rebuilt. Every discrepancy he copied into a small notebook. Not the leather account book. That stayed in his bag, waiting. This was a new notebook, neat and professional, the kind a traveling buyer might use. And every evening, after Matthews left and Thomas came in to lock the study, Elias asked casual questions. Your late wife, Elias said on the 3rd night. She left the estate to you? Thomas stiffened. She left it to both of us, me and her son. But Richard's in Mobile. He doesn't concern himself with the work. Still, he's entitled to his share of the proceeds. He gets his share. Elias nodded, said nothing more. But Thomas stayed in the doorway longer than usual that night, watching him, and when he finally locked the door and left, his footsteps were heavy on the stairs. The unease was starting. On the 5th day, Elias made his move. He told Thomas he needed to travel to New Orleans to consult with his employer, that he'd return in 3 days to finalize the assessment. Thomas agreed, relieved maybe, to have him gone. But Elias didn't go to New Orleans. He went to the parish courthouse, 20 miles east, and requested a private meeting with a man named Lucien Brossard, the factor who held Thomas's largest loan, the man who controlled whether Belmont survived or collapsed. They met in a dim office that smelled of tobacco and old paper. Brossard was a thin man with sharp eyes and no patience for sentiment. He dealt in numbers, not stories. Elias laid out the notebook on the desk between them. Mr. Brossard, he said, I'm assessing Belmont Plantation for a forward contract, and I've found irregularities. Brossard leaned forward. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest Mr. Carver's production reports are fiction. He walked Brossard through it, every false figure, every missing expense, every yield that couldn't possibly be real. He didn't show him everything. Not yet. Just enough to plant the doubt. Brossard's face went cold. If this is accurate, Carver owes me more than Belmont is worth. That's my assessment. And you're bringing this to me why? What's your interest? Elias met his eyes. I don't want to see my employer's money go into a failing investment, and I don't want to see you lose yours either. It was a lie, of course. Elias didn't care about Brossard's money, but Brossard didn't need to know that. The settlement's in 7 days, Brossard said slowly. If Carver can't reconcile his debts, then I'll call the loan. I'll take everything. I think that would be wise. Brossard studied him. Who are you really? Elias stood. Just a man who pays attention to numbers, Mr. Brossard. He left the courthouse and rode back toward Belmont, knowing that Brossard would start asking questions. That word would spread, that Thomas's credit, built on 20 years of lies and a reputation that seemed unshakable, was beginning to crack. When Elias returned to Belmont 2 days later, Thomas was waiting for him in the yard, his face tight with anger. "Where were you?" Thomas demanded. "New Orleans. I told you. I sent a man to check. You weren't at any merchant house." Elias set down his bag. "I had other business." "What business?" "The kind that doesn't concern you, Mr. Carver." Thomas stepped closer. His voice dropped. "I've heard talk. Brossard's asking questions about my loans, about my production. Did you go to him?" Elias said nothing. "Answer me." "I assess properties, Mr. Carver. Sometimes that means talking to creditors. It's part of the work." Thomas's hand moved toward Elias's collar, then stopped. He was a respected man. He didn't grab people in the yard where the hands could see, but his voice shook with the effort of control. "If you've slandered me, I've slandered no one. I've reported what I found in your ledgers. If that's a problem, Mr. Carver, the problem isn't me." They stood there, 2 feet apart, and for the first time Thomas looked at him, really looked, at the scars on his hands, at the way he stood, too still, too calm, at his eyes, and something flickered in Thomas's face. Not recognition, not yet, but the beginning of fear. "Get out," Thomas said quietly. Elias picked up his bag. "I'll be back tomorrow. We still have business to finish." He walked toward the road, and behind him, Thomas stood in the yard, watching him go, and in his chest, something he hadn't felt in 20 years was starting to grow. Doubt. The next morning, the courthouse steps were already crowded when Elias arrived. The parish settlement was the year's reckoning. Debts reconciled, contracts renewed, reputations weighed in public. Planters stood in clusters, overseers lingered near the doors, and at the center of it all, Francis Brossard, the New Orleans factor, sat at a long table with his ledgers open. Thomas Carver stood near the front, composed, his coat brushed, his face calm. A man who believed he'd survived the worst of it. Elias walked past him without a glance and placed a sealed envelope on Brossard's table. "The assessment you asked for," Elias said quietly. Brossard opened it. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. He looked up at Elias, then at Thomas. "Gentlemen," Brossard said, raising his voice, "we have a matter that requires immediate attention." The room quieted. Thomas turned. His face was still calm, but his hands were still. Brossard began to read. "Belmont Plantation, Thomas Carver, proprietor. Reported yield, 1,800 hogsheads per annum. Actual yield, based on mill capacity, labor force, and weather patterns, no more than 1,200. Discrepancy consistent across 4 years. Loan applications supported by falsified production reports." Thomas stepped forward. "That's a lie." Brossard continued. "Further, estate of the late Mrs. Carver, held in trust for her son, Daniel Fournier of Mobile. Disbursements claimed for estate maintenance over 6 years, $17,000. Actual expenses, based on receipts and vendor records, $9,000. The remainder unaccounted for." A man in a dark coat stepped forward from the back of the room. Younger, well-dressed, a leather case in his hand. "I'm Daniel Fournier," he said, "and I'm here to demand an audit of my mother's estate." Thomas's face went white. He turned to Elias. "You." Elias met his eyes. 20 years ago, you sold me to a man named Dufresne, in Ascension Parish. $800. You told our mother I'd run off. You used the money to pay a gambler in Lexington." The room went silent. Thomas stared at him. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I have the receipt," Elias said. "Your signature, your handwriting. Same handwriting that's on every one of those false reports." The old overseer, Matthews, stood near the door. His face changed. He remembered now. The boy in the field. The one he'd whipped for stealing corn. The one Thomas sold south without explanation. He looked away. Brossard closed the ledger. "Mr. Carver, your credit is suspended. Belmont's assets will be held pending resolution of Mr. Fournier's claim and settlement of your outstanding loans." Thomas tried to speak. His voice cracked. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Elias said. "You built everything on a lie, and I spent 20 years learning to read your numbers." He reached into his coat and pulled out the small leather account book. He set it on the table. "Every figure in that book is yours. Copied from the tally sheets you threw away? I learned to write by stealing your counts, Thomas, and I've been studying you ever since." Thomas looked at the book, at his brother, at the room full of men who would never trust him again. He turned and walked out. No one stopped him. Within the week, Belmont was sold. The house, the land, the mill, the quarters, auctioned to cover debts. Thomas's name appeared in the Mobile Register under a notice of fraud. Some said he tried to flee west and died on the road near Natchez. Others said he drank himself to death in a boarding house on Chupatula Street, alone, broke, forgotten. No one investigated. A man like that, once exposed, was already gone. Elias returned north. He kept the name he'd taken as a free man. He wrote one letter to Kentucky explaining what had happened, but he didn't go back. Freedom wasn't restoration. It was distance, control, and the quiet knowledge that the man who'd sold him had died, knowing exactly who had undone him. The account book was found on the courthouse steps after the settlement, pages open to rows of carefully copied figures. Someone brought it to the clerk. The clerk looked at it, shook his head, and filed it away. But the story spread. They said a man came back from the fields with a ledger full of his brother's sins.